Hey students, welcome back, and we are going to get into Chapter 2, Part 1, the Chesapeake Colonies. So we're going to switch our attention now to talking about English colonization of North America. And I've broken this chapter into two parts. Part 1 is going to talk about the Chesapeake colonies, Virginia, Maryland, all of the areas around the Chesapeake Bay area. And then the second part, part 2 of chapter 2, is going to focus on the northern colonies and specifically Plymouth and the Massachusetts Bay Colony in what is now Massachusetts. So let's get started. So you can see here on our list of key terms, the first key term that we're going to be talking about is the Anglican Church. So we, again, are going to turn to Europe and talk a little bit about English history so that we can understand the context and the reasons why people were coming from England over to these American colonies. So we're going to get started with a bit of English history. The person who you see pictured here is the famous King Henry VIII, and you might have heard of him because Henry VIII had 6 sorry wives, and some may say that he ruined their lives. Divorced, beheaded, and died. Divorced, beheaded, survived. Henry VIII had 6 sorry wives. Some may say he ruined their lives. And indeed, it was his first wife, his wife that he wanted to divorce because she would not give him a male heir, which caused this particular religious crisis in England, which is the founding of the Anglican Church, also known as the Church of England. So Henry VIII wanted to divorce his first wife, but in a Catholic Europe, this was absolutely impossible to do unless you got permission from the Pope for an annulment. So Henry VIII sent a request for an annulment to his first wife for his first marriage, and the Pope denied his request. And when his request was denied, Henry VIII said, well, there's all of this religious upheaval happening over in Germany and in the Netherlands with this Martin Luther guy and this Reformation. I think that I have a right then to break away from the church and create the Catholic Church and create my own church, the Church of England, also known as the Anglican Church. And really the only difference between the Anglican Church and the Catholic Church is that instead of the head of the church being the Pope, which is the case in the Catholic Church, the head of the Anglican Church is the King or the Queen of England. And so this gave Henry VIII enormous amounts of power. It also allowed for him to get a divorce. It also allowed for him to seize a lot of the Catholic Church's land in England. Now, the problem with this is not only does it create a lot of political divisions, it's creating religious divisions. There are people in England who, first off, maybe wanted to stay Catholic, or secondly, if there was to be some kind of religious transformation in England, they wanted it to be more aligned with the true Protestant Reformation that was happening over in Germany, headed by Martin Luther and others. So there was a lot of discontent with this creation of the Anglican Church. And what you're going to see is a bunch of different splinter religions breaking off from the Anglican Church. And most notably for our story are going to be the Puritans. So the Anglican Church, founded in 1533 by Henry VIII because he wanted to get a divorce, is important within the context of US history because it will create a religious reaction within England, which will create the group, the Puritans. And we're going to talk more about them when we talk about the Northern English colonies. And those people are going to be some of the first colonists over to British North America. So another important thing to understand about what was happening in England at the time was there was a lot of social and economic transformations. So you have a big population growth that takes place during this time period. And at the same time that this is happening, a new type of property ownership is taking place in England. So it used to be that during feudal times, there would be peasants that would live on the land of the lord. That's where we get the term landlord. And these peasants would work the land in exchange for their rent to their landlord. And their landlord would allow them to live on his lands and also utilize the lands, whether that was for harvesting plants or for hunting, right? And these were common lands. They were referred to as common lands or common grounds. And anybody in the village was welcome to go and use these common grounds. What begins to happen as we get into the 17th and into the 18th century is that these big landlords, these big landowners in England are starting to enclose their lands. They're starting to fence off their lands, and they're not allowing the people to use it for for their use in order to help them survive, right? So a lot of these people relied upon these hunting grounds to supplement their food, to supplement their diet, also, of course, to harvest plants, etc., that grew in the wild countryside. So what's happening is a lot of these peasants now are moving into the cities, and the cities are becoming overcrowded. Now, cities back in the 17th and 18th century were not very clean places. There was no real good systems for sanitation or for running water. Of course, you have horses everywhere and carriages. And so it was a very filthy, gross environment. But then on top of that, you have these people who are extremely poor. So crime becomes more common. People are being put in jail. And so for all of these reasons, people are looking for a way out. People are looking for economic opportunities elsewhere. People are looking for a new start. So it's no wonder then that after the founding of Jamestown in 1607, that a lot of the British people decided, hey, let's go and make a start in the North American colonies. The other thing that's happening is convicts are being sent to North America to carry out their sentence. So there's a group of people like that. The very, very poor who are being sent to North America, they are typically sent on an indenture contract, and they become indentured servants. And we're going to talk more about them later on in this lecture. So for all of these reasons combined, it's no wonder then that the Virginia Company, which is this joint stock company that existed in England, request to the king to have a license, a royal license, basically like a grant, like a blessing, to go and try to establish an English colony in North America. Now, there were multiple reasons why they were doing this. First and foremost was really to find riches, right? They wanted to find gold. They knew that the Spanish had found silver and gold in the Americas, and they too were hoping to strike it rich. And if not gold, maybe something else, maybe some other kind of valuable resource that they could exploit and use to get rich in these trading networks that existed across the Atlantic. The second was they wanted to find a Northwest Passage. By now, people understood that America was a separate continent, but they still wanted to have a quick route to Asia. So they were hoping that there would be a water passage that would exist somewhere up near the border of maybe North America and Canada, and would go straight through all the way to the Pacific Ocean, which would then link Europe with Asia in a much more direct way than having to go all the way around the tip of Africa. And then finally, you have the fact that they wanted to compete with the Spanish for territory. They knew that the Spanish had already tried to establish a colony up in the Chesapeake. It did fail, but they had tried it back in the 1570s. And so they wanted to stop Spanish expansion into these northern areas of North America. So really three big reasons why the Virginia Company sets off. So the Virginia Company sets off. It's April 1607. There's 144 English men, all men, on 3 separate ships, and they land in Virginia at the mouth of the Chesapeake Bay in May. Now, they go inland a little bit into the Chesapeake, into the various rivers, and they decide that they are going to build an encampment, really more of a fort, that they named Jamestown after King James, on this peninsula that juts out. They figured it was a strategic location. They figured it was a way that they could kind of survey the areas around them so they would know whether or not they were under attack. They knew that there were Native Americans in the area, but they had absolutely no idea that they were surrounded by one of the most largest and most powerful confederations of Native people in the region. They set up this fort, and you can see the image of it here. And by 1616, about 80% of the immigrants that had arrived in the first decade were either dead from disease and malnutrition, and then 50% died after the first winter. So just to give you a sense of the timeline, they arrived there in May. By the fall of 1607, there are only, after the Native Americans start to reach out to them and start to see that they are starving and that they're suffering from disease, etc. But by the end of that winter, only 38 of those original 144 that were on the 3 ships survived. In January of the following year, in 1608, a new set of colonists arrive with 120 more colonists, but by 1610, only 60 were alive. So you can see that these early years of the Jamestown colony were very, very hard. I did post a video just sort of out of, if you're curious about this. They have discovered bones that indicate that, particularly in these really hard years of 1609, 1610, that there was human cannibalism that took place here. They just really didn't know how to survive. These lands are densely forested. They also landed in an area that was essentially a malaria-ridden swamp. And then again, they had this issue with the Native people, right? Because even though the Native people did reach out to them and felt sorry for them, the English really didn't understand how to have relationships with the Native people. So it was a constant source of tension. Okay, so as I mentioned, when they land, they set up this fort, and they're really not aware of the fact that they are surrounded by this very powerful confederacy of Indians. And the chief amongst them is Powhatan. And Powhatan is essentially the chief that is the leader of this confederation of multiple tribes. And I have listed out the tribes here for you on this slide. The numbers are hard to know for sure, but it's estimated that there was probably somewhere around 15,000 Native people that were living in the areas directly surrounding Jamestown. As I mentioned, by fall of the year that these settlers arrived, the Indians and the settlers were starting to have a bit of an uneasy truce, okay? The Native people, they were feeling sorry for them. And so they begin to reach out to them again, bringing them food. The English settlers especially really didn't understand how to survive off of the food and use the resources that were available to them. As I mentioned, it was densely forested, and a lot of these original settlers to the Jamestown colony, they were what were known in England as gentlemen, meaning that they really didn't know how to do a hard day's work. And so they were very reluctant to plow up the land and make it and create the clearings that were necessary in order to cultivate crops. But the Native people, they already had settlements and villages that were permanent, that had cultivation fields. And so anyway, so they reach out to the English. Now, it's pretty clear that they didn't do this necessarily for their own advantage, right? But Powhatan, I think, felt sorry for them, but he also did see that there could be some advantage to the Powhatan Confederacy with this outreach, right? They didn't have to do it, is what I meant when I said it's not necessarily to their advantage. In other words, they could have let them starve. There was not very many of them. They were all weakened from disease and from hunger. So they could have let them starve, but they didn't do it. The question is why? Well, a lot of historians now believe that the Powhatan Confederation believed that it could be to their advantage to reach out to the English. Several reasons for this. First off, we know that the Spanish had very tense relationships with the native people because the Spanish would patrol up and down the Atlantic coast, and they would sometimes stop at these various villages, and they would go on slave raids, essentially, where they would take native people captive and they would put them on the ship and take them away. So the native people along the Atlantic seaboard knew that about the Spanish, and they wanted protection from the Spanish, and they knew that the Spanish and the English were enemies. They also were fascinated by the tools that the English brought, things like knives and axes and pots and these modern tools that made their lives useful and better. And so they thought, well, if we could exchange food, because obviously we're growing food anyway, for these tools that will make our lives easier, maybe this would be to our advantage. So for those reasons, this uneasy truce develops between the Powhatan Confederacy and the settlers at Jamestown. Now, it did not take long for the settlement to become completely dependent upon the kindness of the Algonquian and of the Powhatan Confederation. In the early years of the Jamestown settlement, there was two people who played a big role in negotiating these terms between the settlers and the native people. John Smith, who you see pictured here, was at the Jamestown settlement for 3 years between the years of 1607 and 1610. And he becomes kind of like a non-official ambassador between the settlers and the Powhatan people. And then Pocahontas. And of course, many of you have probably seen the Disney film, which I'm going to totally debunk, and we're going to watch a video on that next week. But basically, the story behind Pocahontas is actually a very, very tragic one. And it's not nearly like the love story that you see in the Disney film. But one thing that was true about the Disney film is that Pocahontas was kind of a go-between between the native people and the settlement at Jamestown. She got that position as an ambassador because she was Powhatan's favorite daughter. And Powhatan just absolutely loved Pocahontas, had a ton of respect for her abilities, and allowed her to have this position as an ambassador or go-between between the Powhatan people and the settlement. She never went alone, however. She always had male companions to protect her, etc. But with these two people, John Smith and Pocahontas, there was the ability to have this kind of uneasy truce between these two sides. As I mentioned, the settlers were not accustomed to a hard day's work, and so it was very, very difficult to get them to do the work that was necessary to survive. And so once John Smith, who ends up blowing up he blows up, there's some gunpowder that ignites and essentially injures him. And he's forced to return to England to get medical care. And once he leaves the colony, things get even worse. But even with John Smith and Pocahontas working as the ambassadors, as I mentioned, it was still very tense between these two people. The other thing that the movie got wrong is that John Smith and Pocahontas never were romantically involved. Pocahontas would have been very young when John Smith was at the colony. And I'm going to talk more about Pocahontas in a minute and talk about her story specifically. And as I said, next week I'll be posting a video about that. So let me talk now about Pocahontas. So Pocahontas, who was the favorite daughter of Chief Powhatan, becomes this ambassador between these two groups. And over time, as the relationship between these two groups becomes more and more strained, eventually in 1613, Powhatan's daughter Pocahontas was captured and taken to the Jamestown settlement, where she was essentially put under house arrest and held for ransom. Now, what kind of ransom would the English want from the Native Americans? Well, you guessed it, they wanted food. And what was happening is, as the Jamestown settlement began to grow, and it did slowly begin to grow after 1610, and it definitely began to grow after 1612 with the introduction of tobacco to the settlement, and I'm going to talk more about that later as well. But they started to spread out, the settlers, and they were going onto Indian territory. And in some cases, they were actually stealing land from the native people. Sometimes they would steal food from the native people. So this caused a big rift in relationships. So in 1613, the settlers take Pocahontas, they kidnap her, and they take her and hold her for ransom. Now, Chief Powhatan refuses to pay this ransom because he realizes that by doing that, then he is allowing the English to essentially manipulate his people. But it completely broke his heart that he was unable to get his daughter back. While his daughter was held captive, eventually she will be forced to convert to Christianity, and she ultimately will marry a colonist by the name of John Rolfe. So she does not marry John Smith. She marries a man by the name of John Rolfe, who is the one to come to the colony and introduce tobacco. In 1616, she went to England as part of a diplomatic mission for the colonies, and it was there that she got very sick and she died. And because of that, her body never made it back to North America, and she is actually buried in Gravesend, England. The reason why this is an important story to understand is because after Pocahontas is abducted by the colonists and taken captive and essentially forced to assimilate into their culture, that Chief Powhatan, I think, realizes that he might have made a mistake by trying to befriend the English. And it's said that he essentially ends up dying as a result of hearing the news that his daughter not only has been taken captive, but has died in this faraway, distant land. So, unlike the Spanish, right? The English, they really, really wanted the Indians' land. And you can see here in this artist rendering of this village, right? This Native American village, you can see that there's all this agricultural production that is taking place. It's a very thriving community. You can see that the forests have been cleared and they are growing squash and they're growing corn. And because of this, the English looked at that land and said, I want that. But the English rarely intermarried with the Indian population. So the Spanish, this was very common. The French, it was even common for that to happen up in Canada. But for the English, it was very uncommon. And in fact, in 1691, it was outlawed for these marriages to even take place. So the English, they, with the exception of like John Rolfe and Pocahontas, that was a rarity, and especially it was the earlier colonies. But as we get later on in the colonies, this was very uncommon for this intermarriage. So this causes problems. This causes conflict because there's not a lot of cultural crossover. And because of that, this is going to cause even more cultural misunderstandings. Okay, so John Smith and Powhatan had a pretty good relationship. But Powhatan had a brother whose name was Opacanoe, and he is depicted here in this image, John Smith and Opacanoe. And Opacanoe absolutely could not stand the English, didn't trust them at all. And once John Smith left in 1610, the relationship between the colonists and the native people continued to deteriorate, all the way really until the point where Pocahontas is abducted. So in 1618, with the death of his favorite daughter, Powhatan will die. And when he dies, his brother becomes chief of the Powhatan Confederation. And 4 years later, he launches a full-scale attack on the settlers in Jamestown and the surrounding areas. The result of this is that 347 colonists will die in this massacre. This massacre is known as the Uprising of 1622. The Uprising of 1622 is important because it is going to change the nature of the colony at Jamestown and the nature of the colony in Virginia. This originally was a private venture. It was a joint stock company, so it was private, it was owned privately, but it was also claimed for the King of England. So, but that's going to change after this uprising, because when news of this reaches the king, then what ends up happening is they are going to demand that this colony transform from this private colony to being a royal colony. This also really destroys pretty much permanently any chance of a positive relationship between the colonists and the native people, the surrounding Algonquins. Okay, so as a result of the uprising of 1622, in 1624, a royal team will come out to the Jamestown colony and investigate to find out what is going on in Virginia. And they determine that the colony is in dire need of strong and continued leadership, that there has been problems with starvation, that there's been problems with disease, that there's been problems with conflicts with native people. So what they decide to do is they decide to turn it into a royal company. Now that doesn't do a whole lot of changes for the Virginia colony that much, because there was already embedded in the Virginia colony a self-governing body called the House of Burgesses. And this is essentially a local elected assembly of colonists. But these colonists would now be subject to the approval by the king. So there would be a royal governor that would get sent to the colony to kind of oversee the political affairs of the Virginia colony moving forward after 1622. But it is important to note that in the Virginia colony, all free adult property holding white men could vote. And that was a really important thing for a lot of people. And it was one of the promises of the North American colonies that drew people to the colony. This promise of eventually, hopefully, owning property and eventually being able to have a political voice and vote. That is, if you were a white male. So you can see here, this is just an artist rendering of what the House of Burgesses would have looked like. Again, this is a legislative body, so they would be making laws for the colonies. They would always also oversee the structure of the judicial system, the courts, etc. It was first established in 1618, and it essentially lays the foundation of representative government in the colonies. So this is going to be the model moving forward. And again, it is one of the things that makes the North American colonies unique are these elective representative bodies. Okay, so you can see here a map of the area that I have been talking about. So you can see this is Virginia. The original colony founded right here in Jamestown, 1607. Then you have Richmond, Virginia, further up the James River, 1644, and so on and so forth, right? You see Annapolis up here in Maryland, St. Mary's also up here in Maryland as well. You'll notice here something called the fall line. Okay, this is the line in which you can no longer navigate past because there are a series of waterfalls along these rivers. This was an important thing to know for people that were establishing settlements because they wanted to have a connection with the Chesapeake Bay and obviously with the Atlantic Ocean. So this is really the most desirable pieces of land are in this region where you have access to the Chesapeake Bay. It's before the fall line and you can still get to the Atlantic Ocean. So these are some of the earliest colonies. So you can see here the areas in yellow, these are the areas that were settled by 1650, and the areas in green are the areas that are settled by 1700. So you can imagine for the native people that lived in this region, what a transformation that would have been in just 50 years, where you have the colonists and all of a sudden they've spread out to all of these regions. And again, this region was very densely populated by the Powhatan Confederation, amongst other native people that lived in the surrounding area as well. I want to also re-emphasize this idea of land equaling freedom. Owning land gave white males the right to have control over their own labor and the right to vote. So if you owned a piece of land, you could work that piece of land, that you could make that land make money for you, and you also would have a right to vote. And so this made a huge difference, and it was one of the primary motivating factors for a lot of people coming from Europe over to the colonies, particularly in these early years. Okay, so I mentioned John Rolfe earlier, and John Rolfe, of course, is the Englishman that will end up marrying Pocahontas, at least briefly. They will have a son together named Thomas Rolfe that survives, even though Pocahontas dies. But John Rolfe is known in the Virginia colony not just for being the husband of Pocahontas, but also for planting a strand of West Indian tobacco. So West Indian, when I say West Indian or West Indies, that means the Caribbean region. That's what they called that area for a very long time. And John Rolfe brought with him to the colony when he came this seed of this certain type of tobacco. And the tobacco then gets cultivated in the areas in the Virginia colony, and it turns out that it does very, very well. Now, it's probably no coincidence that John Rolfe, when he planted this tobacco, was probably helped and given instruction by Pocahontas. The native people had been planting the tobacco plant for a very long time. They'd been cultivating it for a very long time. And so it's very probable that Pocahontas had a huge say in how to do this process and also helped to make it successful. So we can see here how a woman, really certainly did contribute to history, but doesn't really get the credit for having done that. This tobacco trade literally saved the Jamestown colony. Had it not been for the tobacco, the colony probably would not have survived. It certainly would not have been valuable to England, right? And when they make it a royal colony in 1624, I'm sure that they had that in mind, was that they could, make money off of the tobacco trade. Now, the tobacco cultivation is extremely labor intensive. Tobacco tends to deplete the soil that it's grown in, and it only has 3 growing seasons on the same piece of land. And then that land has to remain fallow, meaning not get planted on, for another 3 years, so that you could so that the nutrients could be restored to that piece of land. So in other words, if you want to have a successful tobacco plantation, you have to have a massive amount of land, because you have to rotate the crops every 3 years, and then you have to leave some of that land fallow for 3 years after that. It also is very labor intensive to process the tobacco. Not only does it have to be dried, but it has to be cured and processed in order to be smokable. And so for all of these reasons, a labor system was put in place that tried to incentivize people with a lot of money to gain large pieces of land. And so this system is called the headright system. This system was put in place after the colony becomes a royal colony. And essentially the headright system did this. If a colonist paid for their own passage, okay, across the Atlantic to come to the Virginia colony, they would automatically receive 50 acres. If they paid for additional people's passages across the Atlantic, they would receive an additional 50 acres for each person that they brought across. And so two things could happen in this scenario, right? Not only are you going to get massive plantations and huge pieces of private property, because if you are rich and you pay your own way and then you pay for a bunch of people to come over, then you're going to have, hundreds, if not thousands of acres under the headright system. But secondly, those people whose passage you paid for can now be your servants. And that's where the indentured servant system comes into play. And that's what we're going to talk about next. So you may be surprised to hear that nearly 2/3 of all of the English that came to North America in the 17th century, and the 17th century is the 1600s, came as indentured servants. Typically, an indenture would be anywhere from 5 to 7 years. And basically what this indenture was that you were indebted to the person that paid your passage across the Atlantic. And at the end of your indenture, you were set free. Now, they did have systems in place where you would get, what were called freedom dues. Those were sometimes written into the indenture contract, and you can see here an image of an indenture contract. But keep in mind that oftentimes those freedom dues were never properly paid, because the master who was holding this contract would sometimes subtract money from those freedom dues if they had to buy their indenture certain items or tools or things like that. So often what happens then is, if you live through your indenture, and again, that's a big if, because there was all types of things that could happen, not just disease, but there were also a lot of mistreatment of indentures. And so death and abuse was very common. But if you happen to live through your indenture for 5 to 7 years, then you would have to be set free. And if you weren't given proper freedom dues, essentially what you became was a landless, poor colonist. And this is going to cause a lot of problems. Keep in mind that these indentured servants are not African slaves. We're going to talk more about African slaves later, and we're going to have a whole lecture on the African slave trade. These indentured servants were mostly poor English people that were coming from England or sometimes Ireland. And these are also not the convicts. That's a separate group of people that are coming in order to pay off their sentence. So you have all these different types, but keep in mind 2/3 of people coming to the colonies in the 1600s will come as indentured servants. So huge portion of the population. So here you have an image of a drawing of a tobacco plantation. As you can see, you've got, the tobacco growing in the background, you've got it drying, you've got it being cured in the cure house. And so there was a lot of different steps to this process, and it did require a very large labor force in order to successfully carry out the work on a tobacco plantation. So before we end this lecture on the Southern colonies, I wanted to quickly talk about women in the Chesapeake, because in the Chesapeake region, that region that I showed you on that map that was settled early on in the 1600s, men far outnumbered women, about 4 to 5 to 1 throughout the 1600s. Most of the women that did come over to the Chesapeake colonies came as indentured servants. And so the result of that was late marriages, because while you were an indentured servant, it was forbidden for those women to get married. So because women were getting married later, the population growth was slower than, let's say, in the northern colonies. And we haven't talked about the northern colonies yet, but in the northern colonies, typically people would come as family units. And so they began having children immediately, and then they continued to have children. So it was not uncommon for people in the northern colonies to have, 10, maybe even 20 children. But in the southern colonies, those families tended to be smaller because of the late marriage. And then there was also sort of another result of this. Oftentimes in societies where you find that men outnumber women, sometimes women will have certain advantages that they might not have in a society where the numbers are more equal. And this is certainly the case when we talk about dower rights for women. Now, dower rights for women basically allowed for women who were married, if their husband died, they were entitled to a third of their husband's property in the event of his death. Now that doesn't sound unreasonable to us, and it doesn't maybe sound unusual to us, but it was unusual for the time for women to get any property at all. In fact, in most places throughout America, in the colonial days and even in the days of the early republic, all property that women had in marriage was held by the man. And in the event of his death, it always went to the closest male heir. So whether that be a son or a brother or something like that, it was unheard of really for women to actually own property. Now, if you were one of these women that happened to get these dower rights, you were at an advantage, because then you had, if you could manage the land and do everything that was necessary to keep the plantation or whatever it was going, you could potentially be independently wealthy. And that was a unique opportunity for these women living in the Chesapeake. One certainly that was not shared by their sisters who were living up in Massachusetts in the Puritan colonies.